My name is John Geiser III. I've lived in New Orleans all my life. I've been involved with Beauregard-Keyes House since the 1970s and feel a very close association with this house. I've been volunteering as a tour guide down here after the hurricane when we haven't had so many people volunteering, and it's just thrilling to be able to share this house with people. People are just amazed at the history and the grandeur and the beauty of this house, and it's just a lot of fun to tell them some of these little stories that we know are connected with the house. My mother's family came from Boston. They had been in Boston since 1630s or so, but they came to New Orleans after the Louisiana Purchase and lived up in the Garden District and then uptown. But my father's family, my father's mother was French, and they lived around the corner on Hospital Street. My grandmother was born actually in that house on Hospital Street, now Governor Nichols Street, but she was born about 1870. But when she was still a baby, they gave up that house and moved to Contois Street, right off of Royal Street, where the courthouse is now, to get away from the criminal activity that had really kind of taken over this area, particularly the period after the Civil War. I think to a little extent before the Civil War, but the neighborhood really just changed dramatically, and so they moved to get away. And my grandmother's family had some cousins that had a house on Dauphine Street. And my grandfather, who was Swiss, had intended to go to Havana for the winter, and he'd saved his money in Switzerland and was headed to Havana. But the ship sank on the way, and he was rescued by a boat that took him to Galveston. And the Swiss Consul in Galveston told him he should really go to New Orleans. There were a lot more Swiss people in New Orleans. So my grandfather came to New Orleans, and he rented a room from my grandmother, his future wife's cousins, who had a house over on Dauphine Street. And my grandfather got a job decorating the Mardi Gras floats for Mr. Soule, who designed all the floats for all the 4 parades at that time. And my grandfather worked for a while, and then he did go to Havana, but he came back to New Orleans and worked for Mr. Soule again, and then went back to Switzerland. Had no intention of coming back, but he couldn't put this New Orleans girl out of his mind, so he came back. They were married at St. Louis Cathedral. And I don't think they ever went back to St. Louis Cathedral. She was French, she was Catholic. But shortly after that, she became a member of First Presbyterian Church, and that's where they went to church. So I'm American, English, and then French and Swiss. And it's the Swiss connection that I always kind of identify with most, because I'm named for my grandfather, and he started a painting business. He was trained as a decorative artist, and he realized that he would make a better living painting with big brushes, or employing people that painted with big brushes than painting with little brushes. And so he started a painting contracting company. And he was obviously very successful, because in 1915 he was hired, his company was hired to completely redecorate the St. Louis Cathedral. And many of the paintings in the cathedral, as I understand it, were originally painted on the plaster, not necessarily on wet plaster like frescoes, but they called them frescoes. Frescoes just meant any kind of murals, I think, in the early part of the 19th century. So my grandfather and his people painted many of these paintings, repainted many of these paintings on canvas, because the original paintings on the plaster had just disintegrated so much, and they knew would continue to disintegrate. So they repainted mainly the main painting of St. Louis announcing the crusade behind the altar, and the big painting of St. Peter in the center of the ceiling. My grandfather and his people painted those on canvas, and those are placed there. But My father took over the business from my grandfather, and then I went into business with my dad. And maybe we're jumping ahead, but that is how I got to Beauregard House. My dad and Mr. Huber, who was president of the Keyes Foundation from 1961 until 1980s, my dad and Mr. Huber had been in the Boy Scouts together. They were in the same Boy Scout troop as little boys. And my dad had known Mr. Wilson, who was the vice president of the foundation, professionally, and maybe they even knew each other in school. They both went to Warren Easton High School, which was the only boys' high school at the time, and they both went to Tulane. But anyway, Mr. Huber was the president of the foundation. Sears, Roebuck and Company had an advertising program called Great American Houses. And they went around the country and they would paint these historic houses using their paints. And then they would pay for painting the houses, and then they would use these in their advertising campaign. So Mr. Huber and Mr. Wilson called us, our company, and I was the one that came over here, and we painted the complete inside and outside of this house for Sears. Now that was before Joseph Newell had done his paint scraping, so everything in the interior was just painted off white. But the colors that are still on the outside of the house are what we painted it then. But this would have been in the early 1970s. So that was how I first came to Beauregard House and began to be involved here. It was a couple of years later that they asked me to come on the board. And at that time, Henry Keyes, Ms. Keyes' son, the lawyer who kind of controlled all her business and everything, was the secretary treasurer of the foundation. So we never saw, I mean, he would give reports at the meetings. We had one meeting a year. He would give reports, but I don't ever remember seeing any minutes, any treasurer's reports, anything from that era at all. He just kept all that himself. And even now, we don't have copies of that year, those years in our records. The archives are up at Tulane in the Louisiana collection. And I know we've gone through that, and that's just a blank. Henry Keyes evidently just kept all that to himself. But after he died, then I became I was the treasurer. I was the treasurer for 25 years, I think. Doc Hawley was the secretary of the commission after. Doc Hawley lived in the apartment right below this gallery where we're sitting. And therefore, Mr. Huber did not feel like he should be a member of the board of trustees because there was a conflict of interest since he rented the apartment from the foundation. So it was only when Doc bought his house around the corner on Barrack Street that he was asked to come on the board. But I think that was long about 1978 or 1979. We were definitely the younger people on the board. The board consisted of Mr. Huber, Mr. Wilson, Mr. Birkenrode, who he was just amazing. He always brought his checkbook, and I remember after one meeting, Mr. Huber said, that ceiling in the hall really looks like it's going to fall down. Mr. Birkenrode asked what was it going to cost to fix it, and wrote out a check, and they did a good job because that's still the ceiling that's up there. Martha Robinson was still on the board, and her family had Uncle Sam plantation up the river, the one that the river kind of kept eating away, and finally the house, I think, went into the river. Maybe they tore it down before it got to that point. But anyway, a lot of this furniture that was in the dining room and the big ornate sofa and chairs, all that came from Uncle Sam plantation. Martha Robinson only lent that to Ms. Keyes to put in the house. But after Martha Robinson died, her family then donated it to the house. But it was kind of like a step back into time, even though Mrs. Keyes had died 4 years earlier. It was all of her contemporaries that were on the board. A lot of her lady friends, but you could see that she always kind of depended on men to make the decisions, and that was kind of the way the board was. Mrs. Strawn was on the board too. She and her garden club had been instrumental from the very start in the restoration of the garden, which started in the 1950s. And it was Ms. Strawn's garden club that has been involved with that garden to this day. But those ladies, I can remember coming down here, Ms. Strawn and Ann Riley and all these other ladies, just there weeding and pruning and just having a wonderful time working in the garden.
Was this your first foray into being interested in history and historic preservation?
No, actually I'd gotten kind of close to Mr. Wilson and Mr. Huber because Mr. Wilson used to give a course on Louisiana architecture up at Tulane. And I took that course, and in that class, taking the course also, were Bob and Susan Giudice. And Susan was the executive secretary for the Louisiana Landmark Society. And I happened to sit in the same row with them a couple of times, and she said, well, you ought to join the Louisiana Landmark Society. And so I went down to the Louisiana Landmark Society office, which was then in Gallia Hall, and she had all these books of Mr. Wilson's and Mr. Huber's, and so I bought all those there, joined the Landmark Society, and before I knew it, I was the treasurer of the Landmark Society, and then I was the president of the Landmark Society. So I was, Mr. Wilson was the first president of the Landmark Society, Mr. Huber was the second president, and in those days they were all still very, very much involved with it. So I was involved in preservation when I came down here. Mr. Huber was a delightful person to be with, and he and Mr. Wilson had created something called the Orleans Parish Landmarks Commission, which the state commissioned, and the state actually paid this commission to put up plaques. There's one on in front of this house, a nice plaque that Mr. Wilson designed with a little curved top, and in there is the seal of the Orleans Parish Landmarks Commission, which Mr. Wilson designed, and it was based on Bienville's coat of arms. So somehow I got involved with them. I found myself, maybe I was on that commission before I got on the board here, but it was through Mr. Wilson and Mr. Huber that I did all that. And then over the years, younger people came on the board, and Joseph Newell had been the architectural historian for the Vieux-Carré, and he was the architectural historian for the Vieux-Carré Commission. And he was asked to be on this board. He found this light fixture, somebody had thrown it away, it was on top of their garbage can out on the street, and he picked it up, and it was just perfect to put on the back gallery. But at some point, and I guess it was the late 1980s, this house was filled with furniture. Ms. Keyes really, it looked like a Victorian house, just furniture everywhere, pictures, doodads, the house was just filled. And when Mrs. Keyes died, it's my understanding that the family got permission to take whatever they wanted from the house. So a lot of doodads, pictures and things were taken. In the study we have photographs of autographed photographs of people she interviewed when she was writing for Good Housekeeping. But the family evidently took all of those originals, except I think we have Robert E. Lee and George Washington in the front room that were from the original collection. But the house was full of furniture, and we thought all this belonged to the house. Well, it turns out that Mrs. Adams, good friend of Mrs. Keyes, had only lent this to the house, and she had actually left it to the Jesuit order of priests. So one day the Jesuits sent a moving van down here, and everybody was here at the house, was really kind of taken by surprise. They came to get all of the furniture that Mrs. Adams had left them. Well, it turned out to be a blessing. The house looked very, very empty, but the oldest furniture belonged to the house. It was the newer Victorian sofas, overstuffed easy chairs, and all this kind of stuff was gone. Well, I was a treasurer at that time, and I used to come by every Thursday to write out the checks and all that stuff. And I remember coming in, and when Alma was the director, and also when Marion Chambon was the director after Alma, they had lots of ladies volunteering as guides. It was always like a party here. They were all reading and talking and in the kitchen, and it was just a very different situation where we had lots of guides. So I came down on this Thursday, and these ladies were in tears because the house just looked so bare. Well, Joseph came over, Joseph Newell, and said, "This is the best thing that could have ever happened to this house." He said, "Let's do some paint scrapings and determine what the original colors were. And then let's rearrange this old furniture so it really is more in keeping with the period of the house." So Joseph did that. And at that point, Sears was not paying for painting the house anymore, but they did continue to give us free paint. So we did the paint scrapings. Joseph did the paint scrapings. Joseph determined the hall was wallpapered, but came up with this amazing array of colors, including that red cornice in the second bedroom, the Beauregard bedroom, and these beautiful gold colors, all wonderful natural earth tones, and got Sears to give us the paint in these colors. The one exception was the ballroom was the blue, and that was evidently a common thing. Blue was the most expensive pigment, and therefore blue was always used in the fanciest room where they wanted to make the biggest impression. So it's my recollection that we had accumulated about $25,000. We had about $25,000 in our bank account. And so we got Mr. Vignard, old-time plasterer, to come in, and he repaired the plaster in the front room, the room we now call the living room where the piano is. And we found there were two young ladies who Doc or somebody had to do some painting, and they wonderful. They came in and painted that front room, and we got it done so economically that we then went in and did the living room, and Mr. Vignard repaired the plaster and did the painting, and so we ended up doing all of the rooms in the house with all these wonderful new colors. And there was enough furniture so that it looked more like an 1820s house than a late 19th century Victorian house, and really looked pretty wonderful. Pendleton Hogan came to see that. In his little book, Lunch with Mrs. Keyes, he mentions, he really went overboard in his praise, but it says it looked like Monticello and Colonial Williamsburg and Mount Vernon, with the restoration was so well done. Well, we did the best we could, and we got it all done very economically without having to have any big fundraising event to raise the money. And at the end, we didn't have any money left to get somebody to come in and do the marbleizing of the baseboards, and it was determined the doors in the main house had just been painted like they are now. But the new doors that had been added in this back gallery, closing in the old gallery and then new gallery, that those doors, which probably would have dated from the 1870s, had been grained to look like mahogany and oak. And Joseph said he always wanted to learn how to do this, and he said, "Well, you were in the painting business, don't you know how to do this?" And I said, "Well, we did have old-time painters that knew how to do all this stuff, but I never did anything except watch them. But I did still have the tools the brushes and stuff." And so Joseph and I ended up doing the baseboards and the wood graining on these doors. It's come into a common usage to call this faux bois and faux marbre. But in those days, it was strictly called marbleizing and graining. And even if you go in the city directories from the 19th century, they will have painters listed who are grainers, marbleizers. I really think it was when the Herman Grima house started to redo that house where the woodwork had all been painted white. They started to investigate, realize those doors were grained and so on. That somebody came up with the term that sounded more elegant and called it faux bois and faux marbre. I asked some friends in France what did faux bois meant to them, and they said, oh, well, that's, you know, when you have a thin piece of wood and you put it on top of another wood. So to them, faux bois meant veneer. And faux marbre, they didn't even know that term. So I really think those were terms that were made up here in New Orleans by the uptown community that wanted to make it sound more French and more elegant than graining and marbleizing sound. But anyway, Joseph and I did all this. And Joseph found the wallpaper for the hall, which is an authentic 1820s design. And the dining room really seemed to call for a fancy sort of wallpaper border. And that border that's there was reproduced for Andrew Jackson's house, the Hermitage, outside of Nashville, Tennessee. So we got enough of that border to put in this dining room. It had the wonderful red and green color. And the green was the color that was on the wall. And so we put that up there, and it looked so puny. It was just so tiny up there, way up there. So Joseph said, oh, we know how, we'll fix this. So we got some old lining wallpaper, which was just plain paper that they used to put on the wall before you put the finished wallpaper on top of it, and mixed up red color like in the border, and painted this paper, and then cut it into thin stripes, and then we just glued those stripes up on each side of the border, and it looks like that was the way it was made. But it was fun doing that because I came all prepared with a ruler and a tape measure and all, so we could measure this and get this all done. And Joseph was not one to take his time. We'd get up there and he would just put this up, tear a piece off, do another piece. It was done in less than an hour's time. But anyway, that was a very happy memory because it all just turned out to look so good. And as he said, it turned out to be a blessing that the old furniture had been taken away. Sam Wilson was the first president of the Louisiana Landmark Society. He spent his life researching and writing histories, and his little book about the Beauregard House is probably the best source of information about the history of the Beauregard House. You can't write anything or do research about anything in New Orleans without referring to Mr. Wilson's books. And his research was the basis for the Friends of the Cabildo books on New Orleans architecture. And the early books that were done when he was still alive, his essays and contributions to those books were the best part of those books. Mr. Huber, too, both of them had been involved with the Cabildo and Friends of the Cabildo. And before I knew it, I was the treasurer of the Friends of the Cabildo, too. But after Mrs. Wilson died, talking to Mr. Wilson, found out that one of his big ambitions was to go to see the Mayan ruins at Uxmal in Mexico. Evidently, when he was a student in the School of Architecture, World's Fair, I think that was in Chicago, Tulane was going to reproduce a section of the Nunnery Quadrangle from Uxmal in Mexico. Tulane School of Architecture chose Enrique Alferez was to go and actually do the molding of the relief works and so on. And a professor and 2 students were going to go, but they picked 3 students. 1 student was an alternate in case one of the others got sick. And Mr. Wilson was the alternate, so he did not get to go to Uxmal. And after he and Ms. Wilson got married, she did not like to fly, and so they made a lot of trips, but motor trips. And they never got all the way around the peninsula to the Yucatan Peninsula in Mexico, so had never gotten to Uxmal. So after Mrs. Wilson died, a friend and I took Mr. Wilson to Uxmal, and that was just a wonderful, wonderful experience to be there with him. And my friend that went with us was a priest, and Mr. Wilson was very devout Roman Catholic. He just loved traveling with Father Primo, and that was a very memorable trip. We went to Uxmal, we went to Chichen Itza. We stayed at the ruins so we could see the sunset. We got up early, went to see the sunrise, and we also got to go to the ruins at Tulum. So that was really a wonderful trip. And Mr. Wilson obviously enjoyed it so much that later on that summer, my dad and I were going to take a trip to Russia, and Mr. Wilson went with us. And you know, Mr. Wilson gave this course up at Tulane, New Orleans architecture. Everybody took that course for years. And you couldn't go anywhere with Mr. Wilson without people coming up and saying, oh, I took your course. Well, when we got to the airport in Moscow, my dad's luggage came off the conveyor belt right away, but Mr. Wilson's and my suitcases, they never came. Well, they did come a couple of days later, but we were standing there waiting for them. And this lady comes up and says, oh, Mr. Wilson, here we are in Russia. Oh, Mr. Wilson, I took your course. She turns out she was at the U.S. Embassy, and she had not seen Mr. Wilson in all those years, but yeah, he was a lot of fun to travel with. And then we also went to Guatemala. My dad and I and a couple of friends, and we had a wonderful time in Guatemala. We went to a lot of the ruins. The main thing was we went to the market at Chichicastenango, which Mr. Wilson just loved. We went to all the churches we could possibly find in Guatemala. Remember, on that trip we stayed right in the middle of the old part of the city, in the big square, and we could go to the cathedral right across the square. I think we must have gone to that cathedral every time there was a mass there, and that was another wonderful trip. But the best trip with Mr. Wilson was, Mrs. Wilson, of course, was the great-granddaughter, maybe it's great-granddaughter, of Benjamin Latrobe. And she had Benjamin Latrobe's silver goblets. Anytime you went over to the Wilsons and you had drinks, you know you were going to be served in this silver cup that might have been used by Thomas Jefferson, certainly was used by Benjamin Latrobe, and who all else, you have no idea. So Mrs. Wilson had said that these were to go to her niece, who lived in Lancaster, Pennsylvania. So Mr. Wilson wanted to deliver these to the niece. And he asked me if I would go with him. I thought, well, we'll just fly someplace nearby and we'll deliver those, and that would be that. He wanted to take a driving trip. He had a list of all these places he wanted to see and he had never been to. And this was the most wonderful trip. We just stopped here, there, everywhere. And I remember we stopped in Lexington, Kentucky. There was a Benjamin Latrobe house, had a lovely oval room that was the main room in the house, and it was being restored. I think it belonged to the University of Kentucky in Lexington. But anyway, we ended up in Lancaster, Pennsylvania. We went to Gettysburg. We delivered the silver cups, and we went to Baltimore, and of course we went to Benjamin Latrobe's cathedral in Baltimore, the Cathedral of the Assumption. And that was a highlight for Mr. Wilson, I think, of the trip to Russia. We were in the Kremlin, where the Church of the Assumption is, on Assumption Day. And that church was supposedly Benjamin Latrobe's inspiration for the cathedral in Baltimore. So we went there. But also on the list was the new cathedral that had been built in Baltimore in the 1950s. Mrs. Wilson evidently never wanted to go there because her ancestors' cathedral had become a basilica, and the cathedral and the archbishop and all cardinal had been moved to the new cathedral. So Mr. Wilson had never been there. So we went and spent hours at the new cathedral, which is a wonderful 1950s building. Of course, nowhere near as wonderful as the old cathedral. But that was a wonderful trip, and he died 2 weeks after we got home. We were supposed to go have dinner. They had a wonderful swimming pool in the side of their house, but Mrs. Wilson did not like to swim, and so I was often invited over there on weekends to swim with Mr. Wilson. And after Mrs. Wilson died, we did that every Sunday. I would go over there and we'd swim, and then we'd go have dinner at Crepe Nanu up on Robert Street. That had been a bookstore that had been owned by one of my grammar school friends' mother. The Pickwick, the Candlewick, I don't know, it was either the Pickwick or the Candlewick bookstore, but anyway, Ms. Capdeville, Ms. Walter Capdeville had run a bookstore there, and that became Crepe Nanu. So that's where Mr. Wilson and I would often go have some supper on Sunday night after I swim. But on the Sunday before he died, he either died Sunday night or early Monday morning. They found him the next day on Monday, but he had called and said he just didn't feel like a swim, and so we didn't get together that day. My parents had both been born here, spent their lives pretty much uptown New Orleans. My dad went to Tulane. My mother took courses at Tulane. She never got a degree. And they loved New Orleans, but they never really seemed to be too concerned about preservation and the need to work to preserve these buildings. That just was not an issue at that point. Although Grace King and Richard Cope had started organizations to see about the preservation of the French Quarter, I think most people really kind of thought of the French Quarter as a kind of slummy area where you didn't want to spend a lot of time. My grandmother, who had been born in the French Quarter, she, whenever we would go out for Christmas dinner or Easter or something, she would always suggest that maybe we could go to Tujague's because that was in her old neighborhood, even though I think she really thought of the upper part of the French Quarter more her neighborhood than the lower quarter, because she was just a baby when they moved away from the lower quarter. But she always wanted to go to Tujague's, and sometimes we'd go there. But I remember often we would go to other restaurants uptown, but it was always a special treat when you would come into the French Quarter. And that was always my big treat, was to go to the French Quarter. My best friend in grammar school, whose mother had the bookstore on Robert Street, Walter Capdeville, he was very talented as an artist. And actually his great-great-grandfather had been James Gallia, the architect, and they had the Gallia portraits in their house. And his father had been killed in an automobile accident. So he lived with his mother and his sister. And his mother did not have a car. And so we would often pick them up to go to programs at school and other things. And occasionally we would come down to the French Quarter to pick up his mother, who was his grandmother, who lived on Royal Street in this old house. And it wasn't until years later I realized this was the daughter of James Gallia Jr., who was still living in James Gallia Jr.'s house, which is just backs up, I think, to this Beauregard house. But he and I had decided we wanted to be Jackson Square artists when we grew up. And when we were old enough to ride the streetcar ourselves, we would come down here on Saturdays with our sketch pads and our pencils and we would talk to the artist in Jackson Square, and we would just think about this is what we were going to do when we grew up. And one year, Spring Fiesta used to have an art show in Pirates Alley called the Pirates Alley Art Show. And we decided we would enter our pictures, and my friend Walter won the blue ribbon and I won the red ribbon. I remember he painted a picture of a teapot, and that was won the blue ribbon. I painted some daylilies, and that won the red ribbon. So I had lots of happy memories about the French Quarter, but it was always sort of not the place you would go, certainly not at night. And after the war, after World War II, my parents, who lived on Chestnut Street between Webster and Henry Clay, bought a place on Bayou Liberty, and we used to use that as a weekend vacation house. But the summer of 1950, we did not come back to town. We stayed over there. And I was going to Sam Barth School for Boys, which was out in City Park at that time. And I had one more year to go to finish 8th grade, so I commuted into town with my dad. But then my sister had convinced our parents to let her go to her senior year of high school at the high school in Slidell. And there was something like 32 people in her class, as opposed to a couple of hundred that would have been in her class here in New Orleans. And she had such a good time that I convinced my parents to let me go to high school in Slidell. There were only 26 people in my high school class, but it was wonderful. And then I came back to New Orleans to go to Tulane. But my parents continued to live on Bayou Liberty until they died. I'd be glad to talk about my friendship with John Kennedy Toole, or Kenny as I always knew him. Kenny lived on Webster Street, right across the street from the LaSalle School. And we lived a block and a half away on Chestnut Street between Webster and Henry Clay. And a block closer to the avenue on Webster Street was Judge Janvier's old house, and that had been rented by the Mercadale sisters. And they had a dancing school there in the afternoons, but in the morning they ran a nursery school. And so Kenny and I were both in the nursery school, and that's where we hooked up. And we lived just a block and a half apart, so I was always at his house, he was always over at my house. But then when it was time for us to start school, Kenny's birthday was December 17th. And this year on December 17th, Kenny Toole would be 80 years old. I've talked to the people up at Tulane, Louisiana Research Center, where Kenny's papers are, that they should have some sort of commemoration, and I hope they will do something to celebrate Kenny's 80th birthday. But my birthday was in February. So because our birthdays were after December 1st, we were not allowed to start kindergarten in September. We had to wait until the second term in February. So I think it was February 1943, we were to go to kindergarten. Well, the kindergarten teacher at LaSalle School, right across the street from Kenny's house, evidently was good friends with the principal of the school. And everybody said she would get one of the 6th grade girls from across the hall to come and take care of the kindergarten. And she went downstairs and spent all the time, all day long, in the principal's office with the principal. So my parents and Mrs. Toole didn't think that would be the best kindergarten to go to. So we got a special permit from the school board to go to McDonough 14 School, which was on Jefferson Avenue. That was a 7-block walk from where we lived. So my mother and Kenny's mother took turns walking us to and from school over at McDonough 14. And we were always together, always in each other's houses. And my recollection of him, his mother was a very strong personality. And she was always the one to do the talking and tell you about this and that and so on. But I do remember a couple of conversations specifically with Kenny. This was in the early 1940s during World War II. He was telling me that after the war was over, we were going to have television. And I had no idea what this meant. And he explained it was like having a little movie in your house attached to the radio. And I couldn't believe this. I remember looking at Mrs. Toole, waiting for her to say that Kenny was crazy saying this. And she just said, yes, he's right. We're going to have television after the war. So I remember that specifically, that conversation, walking to school. We were together in kindergarten, first grade, and second grade. Then, when it was time for us to start the second half of kindergarten in September of 1943, the school board let us take a test that would let us skip the second half of kindergarten and start first grade in September. So we took that test, we passed it, and we got to start first grade. My parents had told me this test was very important. And if I passed this test, they would buy me anything I wanted. Well, anything I wanted was a leather jacket. So they took me to Sears, which was probably the only place that you could get a leather jacket then, and I got this wonderful leather jacket, which I wore until it fell apart. Kenny passed the test, and his reward was he got a set of the first grade textbooks so he could study during the summer, so he would be able to keep up with these older kids in September. But we were together in kindergarten. Imelda Ruhlman was our kindergarten teacher, and she just died a few years ago. She was a wonderful worker for historic preservation, the Spring Fiesta, the opera, lots of wonderful things. But we were together in first grade. Ms. Langtry was our first grade teacher, and Ms. Cuneo was our second grade teacher. But then in second grade, my parents sent me to Sam Barth's, which was a private boys' school, and I never saw Kenny again. He skipped another grade, fifth grade or something like that. So we were at Tulane at the same time, but he was a year ahead of me. He graduated from Tulane in '58, and I graduated from Tulane in '59. But we were both on the staff of the Tulane student newspaper, the Hullabaloo. I was a headline writer, and he was the cartoonist. His cartoons are still there in the Louisiana Research Collection up there at the Tulane Library. But even though we were both on the staff of the Hullabaloo, I never had any contact with him. Don't ever remember seeing him. And I do remember seeing a little notice in the newspaper when he died, saying that he had killed himself on the Gulf Coast. But I had not had any contact with him. I didn't even think about going to the funeral. But 10 years after that, 10 or 11 years after that, was when Mrs. Toole finally got Confederacy of Dunces published. And she was at the book signing party at the Garden District bookshop. And there were hundreds of people there that day. And I got her to sign a copy of the book for me. And of course, there were lots of people in line. We couldn't talk very long. But she told me how good it was to see me and how much she pleased she was that I had come. Well, anyway, right after that, she called me, and she began asking me if I would take her here, there, would I make copies of these letters she was receiving praising Confederacy of Dunces. And so I was happy to do whatever I could, because I knew if Kenny was there, he would be taking her to all these places. But took her to parties and different things. And somebody had approached her about making a film of Confederacy of Dunces. Actually, LSU Press did not want to publish this book. They really did it as a favor to Walker Percy. And I think the first edition was only 1,000 copies or maybe 2,000 copies. Not many books were printed. And they thought this was going to be a completely losing proposition. So, shortly after the book came out, within a month, somebody bought the movie rights for $300,000. The LSU Press was thrilled because this covered their cost and they made some money off of it. LSU Press got half of that and Mrs. Toole got the other half. That was the deal. They split everything connected with the book. Well, there was a young man from Hollywood who had approached Ms. Toole, and of course, anybody that had any praise to make of the book or her son, she just was very, very happy to talk to them. And this guy came to see her about making the movie, and he wanted $10,000. And she asked me if she should give him lend him the $10,000. And I told her she should only do that if she was really ready just to make a gift of it, because she probably would never see it again. Well, she decided to do that, and she asked me to go with her to the bank, the Whitney Bank on St. Claude Avenue. She was living on Elysian Fields in her brother's house, which had been built on the site of the house where her family had lived and where she actually had grown up. But that house had fallen down or been torn down, and her brother built a very modern one-story house there. And after Mr. Toole died, she moved into that house with her brother, Arthur Duquin. And so I took her from that house over to the Whitney Bank on St. Claude, and she arranged to send the $10,000 to this young man. And it turns out he did not make the movie. The movie rights have been sold over and over and over again, and so the ownership now is evidently a very complicated matter. But years later, this guy did return the $10,000. So I was wrong. It did not have to be a gift. Of course, Ms. Toole was gone by that time, and the money went to Tulane. So anyway, I was very much around her, but I had no idea that when she died, I was the executor of the estate, and actually she left half of her interest to Tulane. The other half she left to 5 different people, and I was one of the 5 people. So for a while I got 5% of the royalties, 10% of her interest in royalties to Confederacy of Dunces. I gave those to my church, and they established a fund to use for foreign missions. So I think Kenny would be pleased to know that some of the money that he created went there. But he was not, Mrs. Toole was not clear in her will what this money was to be used for at Tulane. And so it ended up being used to establish the John Kennedy Toole Scholarship Fund. And I think it was a couple $100,000 when her estate was settled. But Tulane has invested it wisely. It continues to get half of the royalties of the Confederacy of Dunces. And the last report I got, it is now worth about $2 million, generates a couple $100,000 of income each year to be used for students who want to learn to be writers at Tulane. I still get thank you letters from, they think that somehow this is my money. It's not, it's Kenny's money, but I still get the thank you notes from the students telling me how thrilled they are to be part of this scholarship associated with Kenny Toole. And just recently, Mrs. Toole was honored by Tulane, and she was inducted into the Paul Tulane Society. The Paul Tulane Society is for people who have given more than $1 million to Tulane. So Mrs. Toole would just have been thrilled to know that she was included in the Paul Tulane Society. Well, I can't imagine living anywhere else but New Orleans. And of course, it would be wonderful if we could go back to the New Orleans of my childhood, but we really don't want to do that because so many good things have happened and are happening that I think New Orleans today is really still a pretty wonderful place. back in the 70s, preservation was really not a very popular, well-accepted thing. The Beauregard-Keyes Commission had been established, but that was the only historic district in the city. That was the only part of the city where there were any restrictions on demolitions or anything like that. In the 70s, they were just tearing down houses on St. Charles Avenue right and left. Wonderful neighborhoods like Lower Garden District, Marigny, and the Garden District itself, the Irish Channel, buildings were just being torn down right and left. And Mr. Wilson and Mr. Huber with the Landmark Society in the early 1960s had gotten the Landmark Society to give a tour in the Lower Garden District to show people that these were wonderful houses and we really shouldn't just all be moving out to the suburbs. We should really concentrate on revitalizing some of these neighborhoods. And that was when the Lower Garden District actually got its name. They had interviewed Mr. Wilson, the Times-Picayune had interviewed him, and the lady had said, "What should we call this neighborhood where you're having this tour?" And Mr. Wilson said, "Well, we could call it the Lower Garden District because it has wonderful grand houses like the Garden District, and that would kind of make it sound fancier than it really turned out to be at that time." So that led to the Friends of the Cabildo writing their first book on the New Orleans architecture on the Lower Garden District. And that series of books just started a whole wonderful renaissance for preservation in the city and got a lot more people involved. The second book in the Friends of the Cabildo series was on Central Business District, the American sector they called it. The third was on the cemeteries, which of course Mr. Huber was very involved in. His family had bought St. John's Cemetery and built Hope Mausoleum in the cemetery, and of course his grandfather and father had been tomb designers, and I think Mr. Huber's grandfather had built the obelisk out at the Chalmette battlefield. Mr. Huber had written a wonderful little booklet about that. So when those books came out, the whole atmosphere about preservation in the city started to change. The Landmark Society had been around for 20 or 25 years, but that is when the Preservation Resource Center was started, was after the Friends of the Cabildo books began to come out. And so I think today, most people in New Orleans would consider themselves preservationists or of one sort or another. Not an extreme preservationist like the Landmark Society would like everybody to be, but I think as far as appreciating our history and the architecture and the neighborhoods here, I think things are, we never would have dreamed this 25 years ago, that we have so many popular, well cared for neighborhoods. My parents had lovely camellias at their garden over on Bayou Liberty. And my parents, with some of their friends, had organized a camellia club, and they had a camellia exhibit each year. And one of the main people in the organization of this was Herman Deutsch, who was actually the first president of the Keyes Foundation. He was a columnist, I think he wrote for the Item, but he was a very interesting man, a bachelor, and he was a very good friend of Ms. Keyes, and I think he did a lot of introductions of her to people when she came here and wanted to write about her Mardi Gras. But anyway, Mr. Deutsch had a place across the lake. I think his place was between Lacombe and Bayou Liberty. But anyway, he was a friend of my parents, and he was bald-headed, and I can remember my little sister had this wonderful curly hair, and we were with some of the camellia people, and they were always talking about making graphs and getting signs of these different camellia varieties and all to make graphs. And Mr. Deutsch patted my little sister on the head and said, "I want a rooted cutting of this," and all this curly hair. But anyway, he had been involved in organizing this camellia society. So when my dad died somebody, the Men's Camellia Club of New Orleans donated these camellia bushes that are, or some of these camellia bushes that are in the courtyard that were planted in memory of my dad. But the Camellia Club had a camellia exhibit every year in January, I think, and it was on Saturday and Sunday. And on Saturday night, they would have a banquet, and Saturday evening. And Mr. Deutsch got Mrs. Keyes to come and speak at the banquet. And she announced at that banquet, of course I was too young to go to the banquet, but my parents, my mother, I remember my mother telling me, Ms. Keyes gave a wonderful talk, and she said that camellias were going to figure in her next book. And the next book was Blue Camellia. But she, I don't think that the Camellia Club paid her to come and do this talk, but they asked her if they could do anything for her, and she said, well, as a matter of fact, I'm giving a big party at the Sulgrave Club in Washington, the women's club on DuPont Circle that she belonged to. I'm giving a big party at the Sulgrave Club in the end of the month. It would be wonderful if you all could send me some camellias to decorate with. Well, they ended up making this big fan, and my parents were involved in shipping this and shipping camellias to her. Evidently this fan was filled with camellia, I mean a great big thing. We're involved with shipping the camellias to Mrs. Keyes in Washington for the party at the Sulgrave Club. As far as I know, that was the only time my parents ever met Mrs. Keyes. I never did meet her. I feel like Mr. Wilson, and I didn't mention Harney Kane. He was a real talker. Are you familiar with Harney Kane's books? He must have written 50 books. Plantation Parade is one of the best books about the Louisiana plantations. Queen New Orleans is another one about New Orleans, and he was a friend of Mrs. Keyes, and he was the third president of the Landmark Society. And he and Angela Gregory, the sculptor, who were founders of the Landmark Society, were at one of Mrs. Keyes' parties. And both Angela and Harney told this same story, that Angela was standing here talking to a group of people right there, and Harnett passed by with another group of people, and she stopped him, grabbed his coat collar or something, and said, Harnett, they're tearing down such and such a house. We have got to do something. And supposedly that was the start of the Louisiana Landmark Society. Mr. Wilson was the first president. He was president for 6 years. Mr. Huber followed him. Oh, and then Martha Robinson followed Mr. Huber. Mr. Wilson was president for 6 years. Mr. Huber was president for 2 years. Martha Robinson had lost the election for city council, and she was interested in politics, but only superficially in preservation. So she had not really been that involved with the founding of the Landmark Society. But after she lost the election to Victor Skiro, who went on to be mayor, but she ran for the city council seat. After she lost that, then she devoted her attention to preservation. And Mr. Huber had been president of the Landmarks for 2 years. He thought he'd serve at least another 2 years. Martha Robinson wanted to be president, so she had this silver bowl engraved that said, Leonard Huber, President, Louisiana Landmark Society, 1956, 1958, and presented it to him, and that was how he found out his term was over, and she became president of the Landmark Society for 4 years. She was on the board here when I first came on the board, and she was connected with Uncle Sam Plantation, and that's where all this furniture came from. But she did not give it. I think we talked about that. Her family gave it later on. But Mr. Wilson told me that Mrs. Robinson Well, the way Mr. Wilson told me this was, Mr. Koch had been Mrs. Keyes' architect for the restoration of the house. He came back to the office one day and just announced to Mr. Wilson, "You are now Mrs. Keyes' architect." So evidently she and Mr. Koch had had a disagreement. So Mr. Keyes became the architect, and he got along with her just beautifully. And he was always very pleased to tell you that she had called him Sam. She didn't call many people by their first name. And I think I might have told you, I asked him if he called her Frances, and he nearly choked. He said, "Of course not. Nobody ever called her Frances." He said, "Martha Robinson said to her once, 'Now, we've been friends for years now. Why don't you call me Martha and I'll call you Frances?' And Mrs. Keyes said, 'No, I'll call you Mrs. Robinson and you call me Mrs. Keyes.'" Can you imagine?